To the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'm very pleased to rise and contribute to what I think has become a really convoluted debate about the carbon tax, and I hope to offer a little bit of clarity. To start, I just want to be very clear about what today's motion is about. Today's motion is to remove the GST from all forms of home heating, to make eco-energy retrofits and heat pumps free and easy to access for low-income and middle-class Canadians, regardless of their initial home heating energy source, and to finance these changes by putting in place a tax on the excess profits of big oil and gas corporations. Now, we've heard a lot about the carbon tax so far, and I think one of the things that's important to say, Madam Speaker, is that carbon pricing is an important tool in combating climate change. It's something that the NDP has long supported. It is something that we continue to support. But serious damage was done to the majority consensus on carbon pricing in Canada when the Liberals decided to introduce into the program regional division. That's not fair. It doesn't pass the smell test for Canadians across the country. And for people who care about the long-term future of carbon pricing in Canada, it's important to maintain that majority consensus. And we can't do it with regional schism and division baked right into the program. That's why we were willing to vote for the Conservative motion the other day that said that the pause that applied on home heating oil should apply to all forms of home heating, including natural gas, because we think it's important that we maintain a majority consensus and not introduce a sense of regional grievance. The Liberals have said that's inconsistent of us to do, and that's not true. In fact, as I say, I believe it's a critical part of maintaining a majority consensus for carbon pricing. It was wrong of the Liberals to introduce that level of regional division. How do we know? Well, if anyone had any doubt, when a Liberal cabinet minister from Newfoundland went on CTV News and said that the reason they were doing it was to cover their own political rear in the Atlantic region, and that people who wanted a break on the carbon tax should be voting Liberal, it was very clear that this was a regional policy motivated by the partisan political interests of the Liberal Party. Do New Democrats support that? Absolutely not. And that's why we didn't vote to support that last day when we had a Conservative motion on extending the pause to other forms of heating. Now, have the Conservatives got it right? No, because they want to get rid of carbon pricing altogether, and that's the wrong response. Have they got it right when it comes to our motion on the GST? No, because if they were concerned to actually get it right from an affordability point of view, they would be supporting our proposal on the GST instead of harping on the carbon tax as they've been doing. Why is that? Because a break on the GST for home heating would first of all be consistent with a long-standing policy of not charging GST on essentials. It would be better because it would apply to Canadians across the country. The federal backstop on the carbon tax only applies in provinces that don't have their own provincial price on carbon. BC does, Quebec does, a number of other provinces do. They won't see any relief where, as far as they're concerned. But what they do pay, even if they have a provincial carbon tax, is the GST. So if the Conservatives were really interested in lowering taxes for all Canadians, they would support our proposal on the GST. This is not a new proposal of the NDP on the GST. It goes back to the early days of Jack Layton's leadership, who was elected leader of the NDP almost 20 years ago, Madam Speaker. Furthermore, Conservatives should be interested in supporting our proposal because the GST is charged on the carbon tax. Any other day of the week, these guys would be upset about a tax on the tax. But when we say, hey, let's actually remove the tax that makes sense because it would get rid of that tax for all Canadians and would no longer be a tax on the carbon tax, they say, no, the NDP is flip-flopping, we won't support that, even though it's an opportunity to actually do something for Canadians. The other important reason for supporting the removal of GST instead of the carbon tax is because it applies to all forms of home heating. And we know that there are Canadians who are cash-strapped that already are doing the right thing by having methods of heating their home that don't burn carbon and don't contribute to emissions. There's a lot of Canadians that would like to be in that boat, but they don't have the resources to be in that boat. That's why we're talking about a government expanding a program in order to make those heat pumps available to low and middle class Canadians. But the people that have already managed to make that transition shouldn't be punished, as they are under the Conservative proposal to simply get rid of the carbon tax. If the Conservatives would agree to eliminate the GST instead, the Canadians that already have low or no emission heating sources in their home would likewise get a break, and they too are deserving of assistance in a time of difficult economic hardship. Of course, we know that, that we can pay for increased access to heat pumps for low and middle income Canadians because we can levy a tax on the excess profits of oil and gas companies. Now, why would we do that? Well, Madam Speaker, profits in the oil and gas industry in Canada between 2019 and 2022 increased by 1,000%. 1,000%, Madam Speaker, over a simple 3-year period.
Shame.
That is billions of dollars that could be reinvested in lowering emissions and reducing home heating bills for Canadians by transitioning to more efficient forms of heating. Is this some kind of red-eyed socialist idea to go around taxing oil and gas companies? Well, I don't know. Boris Johnson and the Conservatives in the UK implemented a windfall tax on the oil and gas industry there. So I hardly think this isn't about whether you're on the right wing of the spectrum or the left wing of the spectrum. It's about whether you're motivated by a fundamental sense of fairness. And I got to say, this Conservative leader who pretends he goes around the country, says he's got the backs of working people, should be explaining to them why he doesn't support the removal of GST on home heating, because that is what it would mean to have the back of every working Canadian in this country, whether they heat their homes with electricity, whether they heat their homes with natural gas, home heating oil, whether they do it in Newfoundland or Manitoba or British Columbia or the Northwest Territories. That's what it would mean. But he's not who he says he is. He's not the champion of working class people in Canada. He's an oil and gas lobbyist working in the House of Commons. That's who the leader of the Conservative Party is, and it's why he won't get behind a very common sense proposal to help Canadians with their affordability challenge, to reduce emissions, and to make sure that the people who have really been putting the squeeze on Canadians, which are oil and gas companies, you don't get 1,000% increase in profits over a few years without unfairly gouging your customers. That's exactly what oil and gas companies have been doing. And if you look at the extent to which increases in price for oil and gas are responsible for inflation versus the carbon tax, I got to tell you, Madam Speaker, oil and gas prices are a much higher driver of inflation than the carbon tax, which the Conservatives like to say in here, well, the Government Bank of Canada said it contributes to inflation. Yes, 0.6%. One time, we could get a one-time for 1 year reduction of inflation by 0.6% if we were to remove the carbon tax. And after that, continue to go up. Also, had the opportunity to question the Governor of the Bank of Canada about that at committee, and I think it's important to note that one-time 0.6% reduction in the carbon tax assumes that oil and gas companies aren't going to raise their prices, Madam Speaker. Well, any Canadian that's been observing the oil and gas market knows full well that if they think there's any room to increase their prices, they're going to do it, Madam Speaker. So I humbly submit to you that although we don't know by how much they would raise their prices, I think we know they would, and that means we know that the one-time savings on inflation is a lot less than 0.6%, and then you kind of wonder why you're concerned about it at all when you have a perfectly good and better proposal to eliminate the GST from home heating that would actually do more for all Canadians. So I think, Madam Speaker, what you see is that the NDP has a perfectly consistent position. We're advocating for a measure that we've been advocating for a long time. Why? Because it's the fairest way to do it, because it's consistent with a tradition of not charging sales tax on essential items. In the context of the carbon tax, it's the fairest way to do it because it applies to people no matter where they live in the country. We've been consistently advocating for that. I remember when they had carbon tax motions, they've named some of them as examples of us voting against their motion to axe the tax. Well, for sure, I think there should be a carbon price. Absolutely. I just think it has to be applied fairly across the country, and that the Liberals screwed it up by enacting a policy that meant that it isn't. So yeah, I support carbon pricing. I remember when we proposed amendments to their carbon price motions and said, hey, if you guys really want to get rid of a tax on home heating, work with us to get rid of the GST. You know what they said when we proposed that amendment?
What?
No. And did you know that in this House, if you have an opposition to a motion, you can't move an amendment without the permission of the mover, which meant we never did get to have a vote on that. We didn't get to have a vote because the Conservatives vetoed a vote on getting rid of the GST of home heating. The so-called champions of tax reduction for Canadians wouldn't know a working partner if they came up and slapped him in the face. And some of us have had the idea, Madam Speaker. Some of us have had the idea. But we haven't, because we'd prefer to preserve a good working relationship to get something done for Canadians. That's why we're here. It's what we're going to do every day of the week. And it's why we've made another attempt today with this motion. I urge them to finally support it.
The honourable member